Welcome to the Mere Mortals Book Reviews, and today we have a bit of a somber read, All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Maria Remarque. It sounds sort of French, but his name, I believe, is actually German as well. And he was a German soldier during World War I who fought for the side of Germany, obviously, and wrote this book 10 years after, it was published 10 years after the actual war ended. And it's basically the novel of his experiences of soldier life, but told through an alter ego by the name of Paul Baümer. And it's a very depressing book, but very well written and really captures, I suppose, part of the essence of war. In it, he has tales of being under fire, bombardment, shellings, behind the scenes in the rest camps behind the front, a trench life, the boredom, sentry duty, and I suppose in the hospitals as well. One of the things of the book is that it just really captures your attention of I guess like the depressing nature of war and how dark it can get, and we'll get onto that with some of the themes. So one of the observations, I guess, themes for me was that it was his genuine experience, and so there was no filter. Granted, he told it through the use of a character, so I think that was actually a pretty good idea from him in the sense that it allowed him to say some things that he possibly couldn't do if he was saying it as, this is my personal experience, this is what I actually felt. So in it, he talks of the fear, the frayed nerves, the mind-numbing boredom, and also the explosive sudden horror and bloodshed that would just come about during their lives during this time. It was a very, very hard book to read in some places because you could just see, you could almost sort of sense what's coming, it's coming, and then it would just be a sudden explosion of action and violence. And it wasn't nice to read about body parts flying off and his friends dying, and it is a very difficult book to read in some places. One of the other themes was the incapacity to return to civilian life. And this was actually known before PTSD was known. So he was talking about, these soldiers go through these terrible, terrible experiences and then trying to get back to life afterwards, some semblance of life, going back to their families, and they feel disconnected, going back to a job, normal relations, talking about the weather and things like that. And it's like life has sort of been sucked out of them. They've lost their purpose. And so he was asking himself, are there things from which one can do or see or interact in which you just can't recuperate from? Is it a matter of personality? Is it a matter of strength and just sucking it up? I think nowadays we have a bit of a appreciation that there's not many people who can go through all those things and come out psychologically sane, in the sense that they can adapt to a normal life as well. Or if they have, it's because they've had certain aspects perhaps which draw them back into that life more easily. They have a community, they have a support structure to help them if they're down. They have ways of quitting, I guess, or not using alcohol or other mind-numbing substances to draw away from the world, but get back into the world and experience. The experiences are different because they're not as vivid and as intense as some of the things they had. But it's also just that aspect, I suppose. Can anyone go back? One of the other themes is, for him, there was no heroes in this war. It was bloodshed, mayhem, and just it created this sense of apathy, of indifference. And we'll get onto that in a little bit later of why that happens. But for him, it was just, this is war, and this is the war of nowadays, because he went through a whole period, I guess, where it was a very different period beforehand for Germany, and I guess the conception of war in general with cavalry charges, the honor, the distinction men could prove themselves in battle, whereas here it was just a massacre. I think he mentions in this book the French or the English philosophy of material, and it's like a war of material. So it's a war of who can get the most amount of stuff, and that would be labor, that would be explosives, that would be provisions for the men, whatever it is, and who has the most of it and who can be willing to afford the most destruction of that. It was very brave by the author, to be honest, to actually write this book, because although it was popular, it did contradict a lot of the theories or a lot of the wide-held beliefs of this is war, this is what we want to do, this is the good things about war. Whereas there's basically not a single good mention of what happens in this. Potentially, I guess, the strength or the bonding of brothers, but for him it was just absolute destruction and mayhem. And you could see this because when the Nazis got into the power, this was actually one of the books that was banned. So he was not very popular with the Nazis, and it was because his book put a very different picture or a different light on what is war and what can come from it. The emphasis at the start, and I'm just going to read a little bit of his, I guess, introduction or what he wanted to try and achieve. So to quote, "This book is intended neither as an accusation nor as a confession, but simply as an attempt to give an account of a generation that was destroyed by the war, even those of it who survived the shelling." This quote is a little bit different depending on where you read it and which version of the book you have. But I like that the author tried to set the reader up for what follows, in the sense that he's not saying this is exactly what it is, this is what I believe, this is what I'm judging. Sort of like, no, this is my experience, and these are some of the things that maybe you want to think about. And so he's not pointing at people and saying, you stuffed up, this is why the whole generation of men was eliminated and wiped out. And that was one of the key things as well. He talks about the generation. So for him, it was this whole period, this whole time of men in their early 20s or late teens just absolutely destroyed, and they don't come back. They have no voice, they have no say, because they've just been, if they survive the war, they're just as damaged, and potentially it's an even worse outcome than just dying during the battles, because they have to then deal with the suffering and the pain and all the other things that come after that. The final quote as well speaks a little bit about what I mentioned before of there's no heroes in this war, only destruction and mayhem. So there's the final chapter in the book, I suppose, or the final paragraph. "He fell in October 1918 on a day that was so still and quiet along the entire front line that the army dispatches restricted themselves to the single sentence that there was nothing new to report on the Western Front. He had sunk forwards and was lying on the ground as if asleep. When they turned him over, you could see that he could not have suffered long. His face wore an expression that was so composed that it looked as if he were almost happy that it had turned out that way." And that was basically his philosophy, in a sense, that in wars like this, there is no individual. You are a part of a mass. So even though we get this whole book, we have this whole, page-turning novel of this guy Paul and his friends and what happens to them, the enjoyment they get behind the front, the absolute scares, the everything about it. And then in the final paragraph, he gets shot through the head or whatnot, and there's nothing to report on it. It's a boring day on the Western Front, nothing to report. That's, I guess, what creates the apathy and indifference that the soldiers feel, and what this book is trying to convey is that in the big scale of things, when you're dealing with life and death on these grand scales, the single person is nothing. There's just almost no point. And when you see your friends die needlessly and heedlessly time after time after time, and the destruction and the blood and everything that's going on, this is, I guess, what he got from the war. He got that, human life is worthless, that we do things to each other that is incredibly horrific, and what's the point? So it's a dark book. It's a dark book to read. Some of the other observations, it's very vivid and memorable scenes. There's one right near the start of a bombardment in the cemetery where they had recently dug these graves for these other soldiers, put them in their coffins and caskets, and then they get shelled while going through or while in or near the cemetery, and he is, dealing with dead bodies being brought back up to the surface, and him trying to save the dead. It's sort of like a good metaphor for the inutility he felt while fighting, which was, at one point he's trying to save already dead people who had been brought back to life through the destruction and mayhem. There's also another very vivid scene where they're enduring some shelling while in this bunker, and basically they have to stay in this underground bunker to survive, and they're just trapped in there like rats, and you can see all the people there gradually growing insane as bomb after bomb falls for hour after hour, and one of the new recruits loses his mind and tries to run out, and they have to restrain him. And it's just a very, very vivid scene, and there's quite a few of those in this book where you're not going to forget them easily. I suppose one of the last things, observations of mine from it, was the focus is really on the people and it's not so much the events. I'm going to do another book review quite soon of Storm of Steel by Ernst Junger, which is a very, very different book to this, and contrast the two a little bit. But in this book, you can see he focuses on the people, and it's the personalities, it's their interactions during this scene. The war is, I guess, like the background to what's happening internally to himself and the other people around him. And as the characters start to drop off and his friends start to die, it becomes more and more focused on him and what he is feeling. There's the character of Paul. So their reactions to the intermittent violence, to the boredom, to everything that's going on is, I guess, what drives the novel forward. When you compare that to Storm of Steel, where it's more on the actual Ernst Junger, his impressions and what he, like, his actions and the actual actions of the war. So two very different books in that sense, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. So in summary, it's a fantastic book, but it will make you sad. You're not going to come away from this book feeling absolutely great. And for me, one of the things I really want to take from it is to, I guess, express more gratitude for soldiers past and present. I feel that, I'm not the one who can make judgments on whether we should be fighting and what, as we as a country or whatever are doing. But for the individual man who's fighting, they deserve respect and I guess gratitude for what they were doing. So in total, I'm giving it a 7.5 out of 10, which is a very good recommendation from me. A thoroughly interesting, dark, deep, hard to read book, but well worth it if you want to get a taste of what it was like during World War I and for these men. So that was my impressions of All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Remarque. That's it for today. Karen out.